Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now. I'm your host, John Molesky. Today we're going to be speaking with Don Wolfensberger, a fellow at both the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and the Bipartisan Policy Center. Don spent 28 years as a staff member in the House of Representatives, including a staff director of the House Rules Committee, so he really has the insider's view of what's happening on the Hill, and he's written a new book about that called Changing Cultures in Congress, Fair Play to Power Plays. Don, welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
You know, I wasn't just blowing smoke when I call you one of the town's leading experts on the institution. And one of the things that you've heard, this mantra, Congress is broken, Congress is broken. Can you give us some historical perspective on that? First of all, what does it mean, and does it really mean what people intended to mean?
I think it's sort of an episodic thing that we have had periods when Congress is called do nothing and gridlocked and so on, and then something comes along and Congress starts to move legislation that's needed and so on. So I don't think it's a unique situation that we had this prior to the turn of the last century, and we've had it from time to time in the early 60s, and then Lyndon Johnson came along and started moving legislation. So it's really something that I expect more, having studied history, and I don't think it's necessarily a permanent thing.
So is it more a political spin than it is functional reality?
No, I wouldn't say it's political spin so much as just how things are perceived by people that maybe want certain things done now, and they're frustrated when they're not, and therefore, you know, they layer on all kinds of criticisms,
yeah.
And this comes naturally.
Impatience comes into play, and who's winning comes into play.
Right.
So another rallying cry, and you mentioned this in the book, and you talk in one of the chapters about Paul Ryan talking about we need to return to regular order. You hear this all the time. What does it mean? What do we mean by regular order, and when was that moment in history where regular order ruled the day?
I would say that if there was a golden era in recent times, it would be the 1960s and 1970s, when, as I mentioned, LBJ was moving his Great Society legislation, but a lot of people forget, before Nixon ran into trouble with Watergate, that he was putting through a lot of legislation for a Republican who was supposed to be conservative, but he had a lot of ideas as to what needed to be done at the federal level. So I would say that during those 2 decades, you had more of the golden era, or the era when you had regular order, where committees were being used to actually produce legislation. But that then changed around in the late 70s as the Watergate class of Democrats came in, and they wanted more action now, and they turned things over to their party leaders and kicked out a few committee chairmen who were too conservative for them. So to me, that was really the start of this period of politics all the time.
If you track the history of the institution from its founding, is regular order more the exception or the rule?
I would say it was probably the rule about half the time in each of the full centuries that we've had. In other words, after the Civil War, you had a lot of flipping of control between the parties, and so that slowed things down. But then in the 1890s and the early 1900s, you had party leadership stepping in and making sure things got back on track. So, as I say, it alternates, and you can't just say that regular order was either in all the time or out most of the time, but rather that committees were relied on heavily for a good part of our history.
So the one phrase you use to really sum up this cultural change is the evolution from culture of legislation to culture of campaigning.
Right.
You mean that literally?
I do, because what I noticed when I was there for my 3 decades was that whereas I started in 1969, but in the 1970s, you had things moving pretty much through the committee system, but things just sort of reversed order, as I say, when the Democratic Watergate class came in. And so what they were really looking for in turning things over to their leaders were leadership-led initiatives. And what does that mean? First and foremost, it means getting our own people reelected. Mm-hmm. So you had more and more bills being used for messaging purposes, for political purposes, for partisan gains, rather than necessarily for making good policy.
Whether the bill passed or not.
Correct. I mean, you could say, well, the majority could always pass the bill in the House because they have the majority, but things always slowed down in the Senate, but at least the House people could claim, well, we did this.
We tried.
We tried, yeah.
Yeah, wow. And so the rules is a fascinating aspect of this, is that my guess is the average layperson would think of the rules as a more static thing that have been, constitutionally imposed. It's much more fluid than that.
Well, and it's much more complex because if you have a set of standing rules, and now they're around 30 or so, for a long time they're about 44, but what you have in addition to the standing rules, which is the regular order, are special rules out of the Rules Committee. So for every major bill that comes through, the Rules Committee reports a resolution setting the terms of debate and amendment, and those special rules, by their very nature, are departures from the standing rules. So that here you are changing the rules almost on a daily basis to deal with a particular piece of legislation.
Wow, that's incredibly fluid. We're not just talking from session to session.
Yeah.
We're talking from bill to bill.
This started with Speaker Reed back in the 1890s. The Rules Committee became the permanent or standing committee in 1880. Before that, it was just a select committee to bring up a set of standing rules. But then beginning in 1880 as a full committee, standing committee, it began reporting these special rules that were sort of initiated by Speaker Thomas Brackett Reed, so that you just needed a majority vote to change the terms of debate and amendment. So it was a very clever thing on his part, and now it's the order of the day almost every day in the House.
You quote a political scientist who said that it's important that majorities reach decisions in fair rather than arbitrary manner in the interest of maintaining a stable and predictable environment. How does that notion of a stable and predictable environment apply to the current Congress?
Well, it's not stable if you have the leadership bringing up about 1/4 of the time major bills that have not even been reported by a committee. So those are a surprise in and of themselves. Where did this come from? Why? What is it being used for? So that's not a stable environment there. Even with bills that are reported from committees, they are changed quite a bit in the Rules Committee before they go to the House floor. How? Well, the Rules Committee, in establishing an amendment process, sometimes said amendments A, B, and C are considered to be adopted even before you bring the bill up. We call that self-executing rules or deeming rules. They deem something to be adopted even though there's not a separate debate and vote on it.
So are the implications of that either gridlock or straight party line votes?
Straight party line votes has been pretty much what's happening on major legislation nowadays, which makes it obviously more difficult to pass. I mean, the conventional wisdom, prior to the 1980s and 90s was that any major piece of legislation, whether it's Medicare reform or Social Security changes or tax changes, needed bipartisan support to get through. Now that most of major bills are going through on party line votes, the leadership has an extra bit of a job to twist arms on their own side just to get enough votes to pass a bill.
So the story that you tell is one of either cyclical or escalating, almost tit-for-tat partisanship, where it gets maybe worse with every iteration. Right. Is it possible to identify sort of a patient zero where the virus started, or has this been the way it's been almost since?
In my first book, I identify a letter to Speaker Tip O'Neill and to the Rules Committee chairman at the time, Dick Bowling, Missouri, where a group of these Watergate babies, they were only in their second or third term in 1979, they came in 1975, but they wrote to the Speaker and said, we want more structured rules, more restrictive rules. We're getting clobbered with all these amendments that are being thrown up on the House floor, and we're being forced to vote on things that we haven't seen.
And they wanted these from the perspective of the majority.
Of course, from the majority. So they were basically telling the Speaker and the Rules Committee chairman, please tighten things up. So I would say that was a major turning point. And then, of course, with Reagan being elected in 1980 and that change of dynamics between the Congress and the White House, there was more of a need to restrict things and make sure that the majority party at least would have its way on a lot of things while still trying to help the president on things they agreed with.
Has it been a straight line since then, or have there been some who have seriously attempted to change that momentum?
Yeah, there are groups within each party that have fought their own leadership when they were in the majority, saying not everybody is getting the amendments they want. You're not just shutting out the minority party, you're shutting out people of your own party too. And so you've had groups that at least wanted more fairness for the majority junior members, the backbenchers. And so that's what happened was you'd have the blue dog Democrats who were more moderate to conservative. Now you have in the Republican majority the Freedom Caucus, which is a lot more conservative than most members. They number 30 or 40, but they have a lot of leverage with the leadership because they could bring a bill down.
So you list in the book a number of specific scenarios, like the Iran nuclear deal, to illustrate points. One thing that comes up annually is the budget process. What does that tell us about your thesis?
Yeah, the main thing that I bring out from that is that it's one thing to say that Congress is dysfunctional and broken because you're not getting something on climate change or major immigration overhaul or whatever. It's another thing when you're not doing your basic business of budgeting, a budget resolution, 12 appropriations bills enacted before the start of the fiscal year. Most of the last decade, Congress has failed at getting either through on time, and so this has really slowed things up. So I think my point on budgeting is that Congress should at least be able to do its most basic business, even if it's failing in dealing with what we would consider major problems that should be addressed.
At what point, and I know this may be impossible to answer, but at what point does something like the budget process and the way you describe it not working as it should, at what point does that become the new normal and we can't just treat it like some cyclical thing that will pass?
Well, it has. As I say, for the last decade, it has become the new normal, and so what you see is maybe the House of Representatives will pass 5 or 6 of the regular appropriations bill. Of the 12 regular ones, the Senate sits on its hands and doesn't do anything, and so what they end up doing is having what's called a continuing resolution, keeping the government open after October 1 so that they can get their act together and pass an omnibus bill at some point down the road where they lump everything together, no amendment process allowed, and so they just sort of count on what the appropriations committees have reported, and so that is becoming the new normal. You make a very good point.
You say you're an optimist in regard to the institution, but what do the trend lines indicate?
That's a good question. I tell people I'm the eternal optimist, but unfortunately I don't have an eternity to wait around for my optimism to come to fruition. But what I've said in my book is that Congress will do the right thing when there's a major crisis where they have to come together, whether it's something like 9/11 or a major disaster or whatever. That is one scenario, but that only lasts temporarily, and then once they have addressed the immediate concerns caused by that catastrophe or crisis or whatever, they get back to the old way of doing things, which is not the regular order. The other scenario is if one party gets an overwhelming majority and is more comfortable and not as uneasy as they are now, where you're flipping control every few years, then maybe they will have some crumbs from the table for the minority and other members to participate more. So those are, they're not reassuring scenarios. The other thing, though, that I do mention is I think there could come a point at which both enough individual members are frustrated with not being part of the process themselves, and also their constituents are finally getting wise and reacting, although Congress has never been held in great esteem by the people. But, if you have that combination of individual members and the public saying, this has got to stop, you change parties, but you don't change the way of doing things, then I think you could see some difference. So I hold out some optimism for that scenario.
A final thought, Don, is in the area of recommendations. Or if you could be king for a day, what would move the needle the most? Is there an area that you would address? We hear people talk about things like it's too expensive to run, get rid of the constant fundraising mandate, and you could change the nature of the institution. What do you think would most move the needle?
I don't get into the money part of campaigning, although that's certainly a big part of it, because the donors are people that expect some return on their donations. But what I talk about is maybe not necessarily having to get back to the culture of legislating so much as moving on to a new culture of governing, where you're sharing more with the executive by involving Congress more in oversight, not just investigative oversight, which tends to focus on the scandals and so on, but genuine program oversight where you're talking about the big issues, what I call the big picture of governing. And I think if Congress could get back to that, at least both parties would start from a better understanding of what the problem is, even though they might have different ways of addressing it.
Who will that come from? Will it be individual leaders or the people demanding it?
I think the leaders would have to say, we're going to do a few new things. One that I suggest is a fuller debate on the floor of the House before you go back to committees to start working on individual legislation. They had an experiment with that in '94, which you could remember because I think you might have been with another organization at the time, but they're called Oxford-style debates, which were interesting. They had about 3 of them, but they were not connected to anything other than just the idea of debating a particular issue. But I think if you take that, combine that with a resolution that would actually direct committees to look at this particular problem with some guidelines as to what kind of solutions Congress is looking at, there would be a connection there that would be meaningful, and there'd be a little more attention paid to Congress actually trying to consider what the nature of the problem is before they get around to the weeds of the solution.
There was an old hockey play-by-play or a hockey referee who went into the Hall of Fame, Bill Chadwick, who nicknamed the Big Whistle, and he used to joke, knowing me is like going to college, knowing you is like going to Congress school. Really fantastic. Don, thank you. Here's the book.
All right.
Highly recommended if you really want to understand the institution beyond the internet memes or other shortcuts. This is your guide, Don Wolfensberger. Thank you.
Thank you, John. It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure.